Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce two graduates of Brown University and classmates, the class of 1981. Glenn Kessler is he is in the eye of the storm. He is the Washington Post fact checker and is responsible for dispensing Pinocchios. So the Pinocchios you're all familiar with, this is his business. Before that, he was the chief State Department correspondent for the Washington Post, served under 3 different State Department secretaries of state, traveled the world, was the tax and budget correspondent before that, has written on a wide range of topics: White House, Congress, Wall Street, foreign policy, economic policy, even airline safety, and has a book I really strongly recommend if you haven't read it, The Confidant, a book about Condoleezza Rice, whom he covered for during her Secretary of State-ship. And the interrogator, if that's the right word I want, is familiar to you now. David Korn, also class of 81, the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones Magazine and an analyst for MSNBC. And familiar because he writes in all of what maybe I should call our magazines. The Nation, the New York Times, Atlantic, Harper, is often on PBS NewsHour, NPR, CNN. And he too has written a really outstanding book called Hubris about the selling of the Iraq War. Well, you didn't come to hear from me, so on to Pinocchios and other topics. Thank you and welcome back to Brown.
Thank you. Glenn, we all follow your work quite assiduously, particularly on this campaign. And I think in some ways you are both the most important person in this election and the least important person in this election. I'd like to, we'll get to the obvious questions about this campaign, but first I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you came to inhabit this post at the Washington Post and why it created this position and how do you conceive of your mission?
All right. Well, the Washington Post fact checker was started in the 2008 election. It started about 9 years ago. And it was intended originally as a temporary feature just for that election. And it was started by a former colleague of mine named Michael Dobbs, who now writes histories. If you've never read his book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, you should, because it's truly the best book on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so Michael started it. He came up with the idea of the Pinocchios, which was embraced by the Post. And anyway, the election ended. Obama was elected, and the thing went away. And then the editors discovered that they kept seeing traffic to the old articles that Michael had written. Because obviously people would something would come up, a fact or a figure, and then people would be Googling for information, and there would be Michael Dobbs' fact checks. So they said, this is a missed opportunity here. There's clearly a hunger for fact checking constantly, year round. So the editors came to me and asked me to recreate the fact checker and make it a permanent feature of the paper. And I guess they came to me because I had covered all those things that you heard about. I covered just about every building in Washington and every subject. I was not shy about calling people out about things. And I actually think, Michael, before he did the fact checker thing, had been a diplomatic correspondent. I have been diplomatic correspondent for 9 years, and a lot of diplomatic correspondence is interpreting the meaning of what people say, and how, interpreting the language of the different foreign ministers and the Secretary of State. So I think it actually gives you a good background for fact checking, which is, here is what the candidate or the politician has said, and here's what they actually mean.
Now, there's an obvious question, though, which is, why isn't most journalism fact-checking?
Well, no. Okay. Here's what I say to that, because I get that question every single day.
I'm sure.
Political fact-checking is a supplement. I'm sorry, political fact-checking is a complement to political reporting. It's not a supplement. So, in fact, I wrote one of the very first fact-checking articles for a newspaper back in 1996 when I was the chief political correspondent for Newsday, a newspaper in Long Island, because I was covering the campaign day in and day out between Bob Dole and Bill Clinton, and I was constantly frustrated by the fact that Bill Clinton would say something that I knew was obviously exaggerated or false, and when I put it in my story, well, even though he said he created 9 million jobs, actually this is based on a misreading of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, blah, 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 blah. The editors would cut that for space. Or it would get, there was this, because what, as the daily beat reporter, you have to cover the news of the day. So what I did, I finally convinced the editors, I said, look, before the very first debate, I want to put together a big article that says, here's what Bob Dole and here's what Bill Clinton are going to say in the debate, because they've been saying it all on the campaign trail, and here's what's right and here's what's wrong. So actually, it is considered one of the first, if not the first, major newspaper fact check. And that's, I couldn't do that on a day-to-day basis as the beat reporter. But with a discrete political fact-checking column, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump may make an assertion, and I can now spend hundreds of words unpacking it and explaining why that statistic is not correct.
Yeah, instead of just focused on the horse race, the theatrics, the strategy, the polls, who's up, who's down, charge, counter-charge. One last question about this. I've always thought in some ways that the modern rise of fact-checking, even though you were ahead of this back in '96, was somewhat linked to the Iraq War.
Oh, definitely.
And to the fact that the administration, the Bush-Cheney administration, made all these assertions about weapons of mass destruction and the link between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein to justify the war, and that by and large, most reporters, not all, there are some standouts, some heroes, just sort of reported this as sources say, government says, Bush said in a speech, Cheney said in a speech, and it really created an atmosphere in which it was politically very difficult to challenge that or to, not go with Bush as he made the case for war.
Right. No, they definitely, the kind of granddaddy of political fact-checking in the United States is an organization called factcheck.org, which started at the very end of 2003, beginning of 2004. And I think the rise of political fact-checking is definitely a response to the misinformation that was put out by the Bush administration. I've often thought how I would have covered that at the time if I had the fact-checking column. It would have been a difficult thing to do because, of course, a lot of the information the administration was putting out was from CIA assertions and that sort of thing, and a lot of the pushback from it was from anonymous sources.
Right.
However, I do think that it would have allowed me to surface information that was appearing in the Washington Post, but was consistently being buried by the top editors. So, for instance, the infamous case of the aluminum tubes, the Post had a story saying that
some people may not remember this. Let me give the context, because this is one of my favorite stories, actually. This is actually, Michael Isikoff and I wrote about this in the book. One of the big arguments in the case for war was that Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons and was close. What was the piece of evidence for this? That he obtained nuclear aluminum tubes that supposedly only could be used, or only real purpose was for enriching uranium to make it weapons-grade material. And the White House, the administration sort of leaked this information to the New York Times. It was a big front-page story in the Times. And then Dick Cheney went on Meet the Press and cited it and said, look, the New York Times is reporting there are these aluminum tubes.
Dick Cheney, who had authorized his aide, it was classified information, but he authorized his aide to leak it to the New York Times.
Yes, and internally, at the time, this was not part of this is what Glenn is going to tell you. What became public knowledge, but there was one CIA analyst who was not a scientist, who was pushing the case that the tubes were used for a weapons-related activity. The nuclear experts in the government who work at the Department of Energy, which is in charge of our nuclear weapons, were all saying, no, these are not the tubes you'd buy for such a procedure. And the Post,
Right, and the Post had one of my colleagues, Joby Warwick, who recently won a Pulitzer for his book on the rise of ISIS. He wrote a story about how the Energy Department thought this was a complete crock, and there was not, it couldn't be backed up, and yet that story ended up buried in the newspaper. It did not end up in the front page of the paper for complicated bureaucratic reasons, but if I'd had the fact checker column then, there would have been an opportunity to elevate that in a separate, discrete thing, so in bringing that more to people's attention. And there was other work by a colleague of mine, Walter Pincus, who, again, his material was buried. So,
Right.
It was, and it was, I'm not to defend the Washington Post editors, because they clearly bungled it, but a lot of times, the evidence that, the information that the things were wrong was murky. So, and that's why it didn't end up on the front page. What you needed was an editor to say, God, Walter's written this story, and Joby's written this story, and someone else is, we need to get a front page story that says, here's the case against the intelligence. And that was a real failing that didn't happen.
let's try to move it a little bit closer to the present. And let me fast forward to not 2016, but 2012. To me, one of the most important statements made by anyone in the 2012 presidential election was made by an aide to Mitt Romney at the Republican convention at a breakfast panel discussion, public, in which he said, we're not going to be dictated to by the fact checkers. A reporter had been asked him about an ad they were running, I think in Ohio, that made assertions that were not true. And
It was an ad about welfare reform.
Yeah.
And they actually said, but that ad got 4 Pinocchios.
Yes, and they said that, and the response was, we're not going to be dictated to by fact checkers. Meaning, Glenn and others, you can go off, you can review our ads and review our statements, and we're not going to care whether what you say about what we say is true or not. And it was, I think, in some ways, in our world at least, a dramatic moment, because there is this sort of, maybe it's the hubris on the part of reporters, this belief that if you catch someone in a lie or in a misstatement, maybe in an unintentional misstatement, that they will consider what you wrote and change accordingly. And therefore, what you've done, has merit, not just because you've informed the public, but you've actually, have acted as a referee. You blew the whistle. And what the Romney camp was saying at that point in time was, we don't care about your damn whistle. If we think this is effective, we're going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, actually, having spoken to people who make these ads, they actually complain that they have to spend far too much time worrying about what the fact checkers are going to say. They have to assemble their evidence, and they realize that they are now held to account. I think what the Romney person was saying, this is what I've found in my day-to-day work, is that if a politician thinks that they have a line that will move voters, they're not gonna change it in response to a fact check. And that particular thing about welfare reform, clearly the Romney people must have had polling or something like that, where they felt it moved their voters. And, you know, and both parties do this. I mean, on the Democratic side, you know, private Social Security accounts has been a concept that has been dead for years, ever since it blew up in George Bush's face in 2004. That does not stop the Democrats from running ads every election cycle, warning about how, you know, the Republicans are gonna, you know, privatize Social Security. You know, it's, you know, because they have polling that says, if we talk about privatizing Social Security, that'll move our voters. So
Right.
you know, they actually do pay attention to what I write. It's just that, you know, and they will change things in response generally, unless, you know, they got something that says, tough luck.
Well, let's move up until the present time. I.F. Stone, a great columnist for The Nation magazine, The New York Post, when it was not a conservative paper, and the I.F. Stone Weekly, kind of was the first blogger 20, 30 years before the internet with a newsletter, you know, once said, all governments lie. And, you know, I think that's true. All politicians lie, all celebrities lie, and all, you know, sports figures lie, you know, and most human beings, all of them lie. This year, in this particular campaign, it seems to me there's a little asymmetry in the lying. And it does seem to me that, at least within our political media world, there's sort of acceptable lies or acceptable spin. There are certain ways you can sort of, you know, push facts or push assertions. They can be challenged, but are kind of like within the realm of polite political company. And then there are ways of doing it when you literally say, black is white, up is down, the sky is green, the sky is not blue. And then when people point that out to you, you just say, no, the sky is green.
Who could you be talking to now? I don't understand.
So, of course, I'm talking about Donald Trump, who has scored an all-time record high in Pinocchios and in Pants and Fire lies and any other, measurement, any other metric you could come up with. And, you know, and he will, for effect, repeat the same thing again and again and again. He will lie while he's live on TV, saying the TV camera's not showing the crowd as the TV camera shows the crowd. He will say at a debate, I never said climate change was a hoax generated, you know, by China, even though he tweeted that. You know, you're not here as a mental health professional. I think there are possible diagnoses that might apply, but and he's not your regular politician. But has it been especially challenging to fact check him? And I know that you work for the Post, and the Post and a lot of places, you know, in the mainstream media, which is not a term I use at all pejoratively. You know, balance is really important to them. I think sometimes they end up with false equivalence or too much balance. But, you know, because yes, Hillary Clinton has said things, and other Republican candidates have said things that are not true. And so there's often the impulse to say, well, she said this wasn't true, and he said that wasn't true, and you kind of all gets lost in the wash. But is there something different about this particular candidate? And is there a way to sort of convey that while still being fair and balanced?
Right, well.
And not in the Fox News way.
Yeah, well, I mean, we just, we kind of like fact check things as they come up. You know, we decide to fact check something if the statement by the politician is noteworthy, is on a important public policy issue, it's in the news, and so we have been routinely fact checking things that Donald Trump say and things that Hillary Clinton say. Hillary Clinton is relatively typical politician. So, so I have data that says, here you can see the differences. So most politicians that I've rated, it ends up about 15% of the statements that I vet turn out to be for Pinocchios. That's our worst rating. That's like a whopper. And in Hillary's case, that's generally when she's talking about herself regarding like the email scandal. If it weren't for the email scandal, I mean, Hillary would be, I mean, she'd have barely any Pinocchios because she's actually a very wonky, careful politician who has a large staff that vets her statements. So, you know, I can get kind of argumentative and like, oh, it's a mostly true, one Pinocchio,
Yeah.
two Pinocchio, but she tries very hard to make sure that everything she talks about is very factually grounded. And particularly when she's talking about policy, because she happens to care a lot about policy. A similar politician on the Republican side in the cycle was Jeb Bush, who cared a lot about policy, cared so much about policy that he had a wall in his campaign office where they posted up fact checks they liked. So, you know, and it was very hard to find Jeb Bush, you know, in some really, you know, particularly when he's talking about policy, in some saying wild and crazy stuff. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has little interest in policy and little interest in facts. So in his case, whereas Hillary is about 15%, and that was with Jeb Bush, you know, that's your, you know, Ted Cruz was a little more out there. He was about 25% for Pinocchios. Donald Trump is 65% for Pinocchios. Donald Trump has gotten more for Pinocchio ratings in this campaign than the entire Republican Party combined in the last 3 years.
And the campaign's not over.
Yes, the campaign's not over. And he is just in another realm. And the other thing that is unique about Trump is that most politicians, when you give them 4 Pinocchios, they will often drop it. I mean, I mentioned that, you know, they like stuff that moves voters. But if it, a lot of times they won't say it that much again, or they'll try to tweak it in some way. You know, I remember Mitt Romney used to say every speech for months. He said that Americans were the only people on earth that put their hands over their hearts when they sang their national anthem. When it came to my attention, I wrote a post which included pictures of videos of people around the world doing it. He never said it again. He just dropped it like a hot potato. Whereas Donald Trump, no matter how much it's fact-checked, will just say it over and over and over again. One of the pro-Clinton groups actually put together a 40-minute video of Donald Trump saying statements over and over and over again, and they had just had the Pinocchios keep adding up to hit 1,000 Pinocchios. Because he says in every speech, I was against the war in Iraq. And he was not against the war in Iraq, he was for the war in Iraq. And we've fact-checked this over and over again. So he's so it's not a question of trying to be fair or balanced, it's just, this is what the facts are. And I decided to look at a statement just because it's interesting, and I think readers, in fact, 50% of the things we look at come from readers. They say, I heard this on the news, is this true? So that's just the way it is. He's just in his own really unusual realm. And there was one instance that I know of where he did respond to a fact check of ours.
Okay.
And it's kind of an interesting story because it happened after Kellyanne Conway became his campaign manager. He liked to say that 48% of African youth are unemployed. Now, the way they came up with that statistic is they were assuming that if you didn't have a job, you were unemployed, even though most people 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 are in school. And if you applied actually for Asian Americans, if you used a Trump method, 65% of Asian Americans would be unemployed because so many Asian Americans go to college. So anyway, it was just So after we wrote this, he stopped saying unemployed. He started saying they didn't have jobs. It still didn't make it right, but
Yeah.
I kind of felt like, at least it showed that he was reading us.
Now-
Or at least Kellyanne was.
Now, when you often fact check, as do the other outlets, you contact the campaign and you say, this is a fact, this is an assertion you've made. Can you tell us how we're making it? Because my research reporting shows that it's not true, and you give them a chance to convince you, make a case, and in your stories, in your columns, and politifact.org or com? politifact.com and factcheck.org, they do the same thing.
Right.
They get statements, so it's interactive. Now, has that worked with the Trump campaign? When you want to fact check something, do you get a call back?
No.
Do they?
No. They in the 100 or so fact checks we've done, they've maybe responded once or twice. They simply do not respond to fact check inquiries. Whereas the Hillary Clinton campaign,
They call before you do.
they,
We heard you were looking into this.
no, not quite that, but they are very eager to indicate that what she said was correct. They will bombard you with data, and in fact, I will often be getting phone calls until 11 o'clock at night with more experts and more people to argue their case, even without asking. Suddenly, out of the blue, a Nobel Prize winning economist will call me up and say, "I think you're wrong about this." And
This is
Hillary's
like
right.
this is like from Annie Hall. I happen to have Marcia McLuhan right here. That's a reference to the older people in the office in the room. Don't feel bad because they don't return my calls. They don't return most reporters' calls. They've returned one call from my office in the last 4 months when I was reporting on the fact that his butler had made death threats against Barack Obama, and they wanted to let me know that they thought he was a little crazy. But that was off the record. And so, have there been, in this campaign cycle then, have there been any particular fact checks that have been challenging to get to the bottom of? I mean, some of these are easier than others and more obvious than others. What have been some of the more challenging ones in the last few months?
Well, yeah, and I've said before that actually, fact-checking Donald Trump is really boring because his assertions are so easily disproved. I mean, sometimes it takes 15 minutes.
So you're just Googling is what you're doing.
Well, no, it's just, yeah, but it's like, well, I mean, like the thing about the African American youth.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, you go to the BLS, which will tell you, it's
BLS, tell people what the BLS
the
is.
Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has all the data, and you see that they have a black youth figure, which is 20%. So then you have to, and Trump is, Trump used to go around saying the real unemployment rate was 42%. It
Right.
was a similar thing. 42% was that was counting all the people that were out of the labor force, meaning everyone that's retired was counted as not having a job and being unemployed.
All you freeloaders out there, I know who you are.
And so you can, so actually one of my favorite stories, which did involve a little bit of digging, had to do with something that Sean Hannity was promoting, which was Sean Hannity.
Who is a host on Fox News, if you happen not to know.
Yeah, sorry, I'm so inside Washington.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, Sean Hannity is, and he's a host on Fox News, which he really likes Donald Trump. So
Yes, he really does.
and so he often has Donald Trump on a show. He talks about how great Donald Trump is and how Hillary Clinton is on her deathbed. So he was promoting the idea that Donald Trump had, there were some Marines during the Persian Gulf War were stranded, at an army base, Marine base, and Donald Trump sent his private plane to the Marine base to fly them back home to Florida. And so a reader wrote to me and said, "Is this true?"
Because it was, I remember this was a great one. It was supposed to show his generosity, how he supported the troops.
And Sean Hannity came up with this when Trump was under fire from the Washington Post for having not made the donation to the veterans that he had promised to make.
Mhm.
So that's why this came up. And so, this was some time ago. But the first thing I noticed, because Sean Hannity included a picture of the plane, all the troops standing in front of the plane. And I look at it, and I used to cover airline safety. I look at it and say, that's not Trump's plane, that's the Trump shuttle,
Which was?
which was an airline that Donald Trump briefly owned until the banks took it over because he couldn't pay his bills. So, and then, I realized that, well, wait, when this happened, actually, Trump wasn't running the airline anymore. It was run by the banks. Ultimately, I found a general who was in charge of logistics who kept a diary and notes. And so, I've tracked him down in Seattle, and he went through his diary. And, I was able to document that the Trump shuttle had a contract to ferry troops around the country. And and in fact, the reason why the Trump shuttle had so excess planes to be able to do this is because Donald Trump was such a dumbo when he bought the airline that he bought the Trump shuttle from a guy named Frank Lorenzo, who used to run Eastern Airlines. And Donald Trump wanted to reduce the price for some reason. And Lorenzo said to him, well, rather than reduce the price, I'll give you 4 more planes. And Trump, not realizing that that's actually bad, because planes lose money for you unless you fill them with seats. And the 4 extra planes were going to do him nothing on a route that is set, just shuttling people back and forth between Washington and New York and Boston. So that's why they didn't know what to do with the excess planes, so the banks decided to ferry troops around the country. Anyway.
Now, that was the great fact check. That's probably probably the hardest one you've done, and it was kind of the most ridiculous one. And of course, it's the type of thing that Sean Hannity was talking about this. Donald Trump knew he was talking about this, and I think Donald Trump would have remembered if he had actually given his private plane for a purpose like this, and yet he never said, no, Sean, I'd like to take credit, but I couldn't.
No, he confirmed it.
Yes,
He
yes.
said, I did this.
Yes. Yes. So, thinking that, that no fact checker had an aviation background as you did. So you talked a little bit about engaging with the Clinton campaign. Can you talk about any specific fact check of hers that you've done, and even one that you started out doing that you thought would go one way that went another way?
Well, there was, I do the column with a colleague. Her name is Michelle Lee. There was one that Michelle did, which it was funny because there was a speech that Clinton was giving, and she was, let's see, make sure I get this right. Clinton was talking about that it is indeed the law in the United States that you can't you in many places you're prevented from talking about your salary with other coworkers.
Mm-hmm.
And Michelle was listening to the speech and said, well, that's not right. There are a few exceptions. And then suddenly Clinton says, however, there are 3 exceptions. And Clinton went through and listed them.
So you thought you had her.
And we ended up doing a fact check, and because there was something slightly off she got, but it
Yeah.
was just, to me, it was like a classic example of how very well grounded Clinton is in policy, where, she started to say something and actually knew that there were 3 exceptions to this kind of broad-based thing that she was saying. The most challenging fact checks with Clinton have had to do with emails, because, and that's where, she's gotten herself most in trouble, because in this case, I think the Clinton campaign had set out a line, a series of statements, talking points, to defend herself against emails, and as more information came out, they desperately didn't want to have any daylight between their original statements and what actually emerged. So the statements she made got increasingly tortured and couldn't really be sustained. And yet she wouldn't back off that because, of course, then people would say, aha.
She lied, she covered up, whatever.
And so, and a lot of her statements, you know, she is a lawyer, were very legalistic, and she would do things to try. It was I always, fact-checking Clinton on the emails, I thought was always like a game of three-card Monte. Because they were like moving the things around so that you wouldn't notice, you know, you couldn't see where the ball was because, you know, so those were always very challenging. But now I think we pretty much know everything we need to know about the email issue.
So I've noticed something in this campaign, I think because of Donald Trump, and I want to get your reaction to this, in that people in the establishment media have usually tended in reporting, not in what you do, but in reporting, to refrain from saying a statement is a lie, even from sometimes saying it's false. And often, you know, they'll say politician, government official says X, and then maybe they'll say someone else says Y, but they won't call it a lie. They won't say, you know, candidate B lied today when they said at a rally, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, or made a false statement. They're very, very shy about doing that. I think, you know, for fear of looking like they're not being objective or balanced, or that we report people and other people can determine for themselves whether it's true or not. It's not our job, which of course is not your job. But it seems that a few barriers have been broken this time because of Donald Trump. And I noticed a bit of an inflection point when, about 3-4 weeks ago, when he did his birther press conference. Literally 2, 3, 4 days before that, there was a front page story in the New York Times saying that he had released his child care, daycare, you know, proposal, which really was basically Ivanka's proposal, and when he released it, he said he was the only one. He's the only candidate in the race with a child care proposal. And the Times said something like, and that was a bit of a stretch because Hillary Clinton released a proposal a year ago. Now, it's more than a stretch. It's a lie. And it's a lie that you can determine because you can see it on her website. And in fact, he'd already been called out on this point before he made this claim. And as a guy who wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Lies of George W. Bush, I've always been an advocate of the media prudently and accurately being more assertive in this regard. And then, literally a couple of days after the stretch remark, or story in the Times, and I don't want to blame any particular reporters, because a lot of these calculations, a lot of this language is done sort of jointly with editors and with others. Well, what can we call this? What's the right terminology? And sometimes a reporter may want to say one thing, and editors say, well, let's make it stronger, or let's dial it back, whatever. So it's really kind of a collective decision when you look at something like that. But then, a few days later, Donald Trump held this press conference, which he was going to say that Obama was born in America, and he came out, and it was 5 statements. You know, Hillary Clinton started the birther stuff. I finished it, and you know what that means. And he was born in the U.S., and he walked out. And he had sucker punched the media because he got everyone to his hotel, commercial for the hotel. He had 20 military guys get up before this and say how great he was for national security. And all this was covered kind of live by the media, who thought he was going to be penitent about being a birther. And the front page of the Times, you know, the front post, whenever it appeared, you know, said, Donald Trump talks about birtherism unwinding a lie. And again and again and again on CNN and MSNBC, not on Fox, but on the network news, they all said that he lied when he said Hillary Clinton started it. They used the L word. And it was like breaking the blood barrier. They had gone where no reporter had ever gone before. I mean, am I being overly dramatic, or did you sense a shift?
No, there was definitely a shift there. I actually shy away from the word lie in what I write. I mean, if you can make your own judgment of four Pinocchios. But the reason is, it's hard to get in a person's mind. Sometimes a four Pinocchio statement is something that's just stupid and wrong. And maybe they didn't realize it. In the case of Donald Trump, I think one reason why you see this barrier broken, is because he keeps saying it, even though it's been fact checked. So at that point, you can no longer say,
Right.
that he's unaware that there's some controversy about what he's saying. And so that's the case with the birther thing, which was a lie when he was trying to say that
Yeah.
Barack Obama was not born in the United States. And then when he was trying to say Hillary Clinton started it, and when he says he was against the war in Iraq, those were all things that and I did actually do a piece. It was a little more analytical, where I showed how there were a lot of statements where Donald Trump it's been proven this is completely false, but he won't back away from it. So the interesting thing about the war in Iraq is he started out saying, and he said this often, that he was so against the war in Iraq that the White House sent a delegation to tell him to be quiet about it, to shut up, you're causing too much trouble. So of course we investigated this, and we contacted like 24 people that worked in the Bush White House. There was no delegation, nobody, because they didn't know what his policy was, or his position. Because then, of course, we investigated, turns out what he had said was actually supportive, not against it. So then it turned into, I told Sean Hannity privately I was against the war in Iraq. So, you notice he's assuming people forget that he used to say that he was so loud and vocal that the White House got him
Yeah.
to be quiet.
And in fact, there are very, very few public statements that anyone has found about him talking about the war in Iraq. And so the idea that he was making, a mess of this for the White House is in itself a lie.
Right.
Regardless what he was saying. We're going to go to you guys with questions in a moment. I'm going to call on more students than non-students. I will make stereotypical judgments about who looks to be a student. I apologize in advance. I will be student profiling. And if students don't raise their hands, I will start calling them people. So everybody better think of a question. Okay, and it can be about what we've talked about. It also can be about other journalistic issues or other things related to this campaign. But my last question for now is to sort of step a little bit away from the fact checking into the analytical side here. And you obviously care about politicians and other leaders getting things right. Here you have a fellow who has broken all known records in the history of fact checking, and yet, regardless of what's going to be the eventual outcome of this campaign, he did get the nomination of what used to be a major party, and he will have tens of millions of Americans voting for him. Could well be over 50 million. You can still lose with 50 million votes. I don't think Donald Trump knows that, but it's mathematically possible, because someone else will get 60 or 70 million. So, taking a step back from all this, what do you think it signifies that a fellow who could be as cavalier with the truth and be so insistent on things that have been proven wrong, particularly about himself, but about everything as well, can be such a political success in this country?
Well, if he ends up losing in the way that the polls indicate he will lose, I don't think he'll be viewed as a political success. And so it would indicate to me that it's not a successful way to win a presidential election. Obviously, the reasons why people support Donald Trump. Some of it is party loyalty. He has the Republican tag, and and for some people that's very difficult to switch their parties. They'll support whoever the party nominates. He's obviously also resonating with a group of Americans that feels that Washington has let them down. I think that one thing that I've thought about in terms of from the fact that he says so many things that are wrong, I think he actually is saying things that those people believe. So, you know, that's a challenge for me as someone who tries to tell people what the truth is, that when he says that, you know, the unemployment rate is, you know, really 40%, he's saying people that support him actually believe that is the case. And, you know, I can write till I'm blue in the face, no, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says it's actually 5%. They believe it's 40%. So a lot of the things, you know, when he says he saw Muslims cheer when the World Trade Towers came down, these are people that believe.
Thousands, he saw thousands.
He saw thousands, but they believe. And in fact, I've traced it, my suspicion is, considering, based on all the messages I've gotten from readers, what they're thinking of is there was a loop video that ran constantly on Fox News of a handful of people in Gaza celebrating the fall of the Twin Towers, and ran over and over and over and over again on Fox. And for people, you know, a lot of Americans, they may not know the difference between Gaza and Jersey City or whatever. They just saw that there were these, you know, because there were lots of people that actually sent this to me and said, here it is, here's the proof. And I'd write back and say, actually, that's not Jersey City, that's Gaza, and it's not thousands, it's just 3 people.
And it's not and it's not Americans.
Yeah, yes, but you know, it gets, you know, memories and images, you know, people, they're very easily manipulated and malleable over time. And so when he says this, he is actually giving the facts that his supporters believe in, even though they're not really facts at all.
Yeah.
So, what that says about the state of our society is left for the political scientists in this building.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go to some questions. So let's see some hands. Start with you.
Thank you very much for coming. So you told us that Trump doesn't care about like fact checks. He keeps lying in his lies. But to what extent is supporters caring about the fact checks? Like, are they starting to rethink their decisions, or they don't care about the fact checks at all?
Well, you know, I would say that you know, there's academic studies that show that you are more likely to accept information that already confirms your preconceived notions. So if I write a fact check that is critical of Donald Trump, it's widely embraced by Democrats, but not many Republicans. If I write a fact check that is critical of Hillary Clinton, I find that it's widely circulated by Republicans, but not embraced by Democrats. So there are a sliver of readers that send me nice notes and say they learned a lot from reading what I write, but generally people will cheer on their home team.
And there are other studies as well. Particularly, I think they've used climate change as a way to do this, in which they ask a person's position on climate change to find someone who doesn't believe in it, whatever, and then they give them information, what they consider to be factual information, showing that it does exist, and then they ask people again, and it turns out they hold on to their initial views even more strongly. So you know, you get challenged on something that you think you know something about. You know, unfortunately, the inclination isn't to say, oh, let me rethink my assumptions. Often it is to sort of hunker down and hold on to it even more firmly. And what Donald Trump is now doing is making Glenn the enemy. You know, the media is in league with the international bankers, which I haven't heard that phrase in a long time, and it's scary for certain reasons. And with the
Protocols of Zion.
yeah, and you know, with the criminal Clintons, they're all working together in a conspiracy to betray America. If you hadn't seen the speech he did yesterday, afternoon. I mean, he really, for all the Spinal Tap fans out there, he went up to 11. And I think, and we have 28, almost a month, 28 days or so to go. 26 days. I think we'll be up to.
Not that I'm counting.
I expect we'll be up to 111 by the time we get to Election Day. And so what he's done is to say anything that Glenn writes, all these stories about these accusers who are coming forward and telling stories of him harassing or abusing them, the New York Times and all that, they're all in league. It's all a betrayal, not of me, against you, the people voting for me. That's the key thing here. He's not, and so today, he's scheduled to give a speech, I don't know if it's happened yet, in which he's going to argue that the New York Times, because it's partly financed by Carlos Slim, a Mexican billionaire, that's why it's against him. And he'll keep doing this. And so so you have sort of this face-off between, independent reporters such as Glenn and others, saying, we're just trying to tell you the truth, the way at least we see it, versus Trump, who's saying to his audience, don't believe them, they're the problem, they're after me. I get about 27 fundraising emails from the Donald Trump campaign every day because I'm on different conservative mailing lists. A couple months ago, there was a noticeable shift. Every single one of them, without fail, attacks the liberal media. It's part of the conservative playbook. By liberal media, they don't mean Mother Jones. They mean...
You are liberal.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, there is liberal media out there. And when I look at the New York Times and Washington Post, I don't see it. I love them for other reasons, but that's not their job. And and there's conservative media, like the National Review and the Weekly Standard, and they do some good stuff too.
And they're actually pretty anti-Trump.
They're anti-Trump. They're very anti-Trump, both of them these days. So, but to him, it's all liberal media. So, he's telling his audience basically, don't believe those fact-checking. And there was a guy who ran for treasurer, I think, in Ohio, Josh Mandel, a cycle or two ago, who also had a long range of whoppers and being fact-checked. And at one point, at a rally, he said, they said, I said 4 Pinocchios or whatever, pants on fire, whatever it was. I wear this as a badge of honor. This is the liberal media. And he turned it into a positive for his crowd.
I have tremendous respect for the Fourth Estate and journalists. Obviously, I think the work that you're doing is very important. But
I knew there was a but coming. There's always a but.
if you have people like Mandel and Romney saying we're just going to blatantly ignore this, then how can we? Is there any policy thing that we can implement such that this actually has a little more weight to it?
Mean like lock them up?
Pinocchios and more, you're ineligible for.
Glenn would become the most.
Actually, I think there was a case from Ohio that went to the Supreme Court. Because it was, God, I'm now forgetting the details, but it was like 2 years ago where, and it had to do about, whether or not, what the politician was saying. There was some law passed about how you couldn't lie, and it went up to the Supreme Court, and basically they ruled.
The state Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I need to. I'm sure you can
Google it. You can Google it by the time we try to figure it out.
But anyway, they ruled that, as a politician, there was no crime in not telling the truth, right?
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, the hard thing is,
it's a crime if you say it if you lie under oath, but if no one went to jail for misleading the American people.
we have a First Amendment, which means, the government cannot restrain free speech. It doesn't say free and accurate speech. So people have a constitutional right to be wrong, to be stupid, and to try to fool other people. They have that right. And, at the end of the day, the democracy, the republic depends on having citizens who are smart enough to make the right decisions, locally, nationally, about policy matters. And, I really think that the rise of fact-checking has been a great thing. And I love it when you hear sometimes Donald Trump say, Clinton got 4 Pinocchios in this. It's really quite funny that he would do that. It just makes you laugh thinking about it. And so, there's at least more ammunition now for people who care about holding
And-
politicians accountable.
And actually, as of yesterday, Google announced they will start elevating fact checks in their Google News results,
Whoa.
which is something that I had actually gone to Google about a year and a half ago and proposed this. And
So that means when you type in Trump 48% unemployment, you should be on the first page, if not the top.
Right, you're right. And, and so that will maybe help matters as well.
Yeah. Oh, what about you? Yeah.
I'm wondering what it's been like at the Washington Post before, during, and after the release of the book, the Billy Bush tapes. And it's like so many outrageous things happen that were you all like, well, here's one more, or were you like, this is the bombshell that's going to kill the whole thing?
Well, the reporter who got that tape, his name is David Fahrenholt. He has done a series of really great pieces looking into the Trump Foundation. So, and he's really actively used social media to help people out there, help him with his research. I think it's a kind of pioneering way of doing journalism.
Tell him how he found the photo, the painting.
Well,
Yeah, explain what the painting is.
yeah, one of the things he discovered was that Donald Trump used his foundation money to buy a painting of himself. Now,
Not just any painting, but
yeah, like 6-foot tall painting.
a 6-foot,
And he did this twice. Now, there's no problem with a foundation using foundation money to buy a painting if it then donates it to charity or something
if
like
it's
that.
used for a charitable purpose.
Right, but the problem, so what David needed to find out was, where was this painting? And a reader started going through Donald Trump's properties on TripAdvisor, all the photographs, and found the painting on the wall of the bar on TripAdvisor. And then someone else actually booked a room at the hotel and went and documented the painting was there on the wall on the bar, which is, the Trump people later said that the resort was providing safekeeping for the foundation. But if you
I mean, putting a picture of yourself on the wall of a bar at a profit-making enterprise is not a charitable purpose.
right, no, I guess if you've ever seen the movie Spotlight, there's the editor of the Boston Globe there, Marty Barron, is the guy that tells the reporters, you really need to dig into this and find out what's going on here. So Marty Barron is now the editor of the Washington Post, and it was Marty Barron that pulled David Fahrenholt aside and said, you've done some really good reporting on Trump and his inability to pay what he claimed he paid to veterans. Why don't you take a closer look at his foundation? Which just shows you how, a good editor with a news sense. So David has been writing story after story after story, and ultimately got the state of New York to basically say the foundation was operating in a fraudulent manner. And, good stories beget other good stories. And in this case, someone, I guess, in NBC land, who felt there was a problem with the network sitting on that video for so many days, sent it to David. And, it only took 5 hours from David getting the phone call to when we posted it. We knew it was very competitive, and we knew that it would, make a bit of a splash. And because what's interesting about
Even
that,
on a Friday afternoon.
even on a Friday afternoon. But the interesting thing about that, and it just shows the power of video and audio, is that, 4 days earlier, the Associated Press had done a really good story about the way Donald Trump acted around the beauty pageants, and described a number of women on the record describing what he did and how disgusting it was. And that story was there, it kind of
And there was a story about him on the set of The Apprentice, making, they had 21 sources, 12 named, 9 anonymous, who all talked about the very lewd remarks he made on the set of Apprentice when the cameras were rolling, but not on tape that would be aired, which is why now there's pressure for the owners of the show, MGM and Mark Burnett Productions, to release those tapes. And it's unclear what the chronology is here, but AP did that story, and it's possible that that led to Access Hollywood, which is owned by NBC Entertainment, not NBC News, to say, hey, let's go look for our tapes. And, or it may be possible they were looking already, but that might have given them extra impetus.
Well, there's various things. There's also a story that Billy Bush was heard bragging about
Yes.
this tape while he was at the Olympics. And so then.
To other NBC colleagues.
Other NBC colleagues, and then the NBC colleagues started, then it inspired someone to look for the tape. So it's unclear exactly how it unfolded. But and the fascinating thing about that tape is how complete it was, because you had not only the conversation on the bus, but then
The walkthrough.
the walkthrough, which kind of, the walkthrough had been foreshadowed by the conversation on the bus. So it was about as perfect as a piece of evidence you could find. But
Right.
anyway,
All the way in the back.
So recently, debates have been criticized for their lack of fact-checking. Are you of the opinion that fact-checking would be beneficial to viewers of debates, or would it somehow ruin the flow of debates and make them less entertaining to watch or less interesting to watch?
well, I don't know if the debates are for entertainment. I actually,
If you're a sick individual, they are.
I'm actually, you probably in a minority among people who do fact checking on this. I frankly think the point of the debate is for viewers to see the candidates confront each other and to have a discussion there. So I think the moderators, they can use fact checks to set up questions or sometimes to clarify a point. But I'm not sure what it gains if the X candidate says something and then the moderator says, well, actually, you just said this, but the Washington Post had previously said that was worthy of 3 Pinocchios. That's not why people are watching the debate. They want to get a sense of the candidates for president. They want to see how they respond to good, reasoned questions. And it's really up to the candidates to fact check each other. And if there's a dispute afterwards, then they can go read what we write in the Washington Post. 4 years ago, Candy Crowley, she tried to do that, and she got it wrong. So, so the Romney people felt very aggrieved by that, and I think, rightly so. So, that's the other thing. If you're going to actually fact check them, you have to be right. I mean, the best example of a good fact check during a debate that I saw was something that Mike Wallace did in one of the Republican debates, where he was actually
Chris Wallace.
Sorry, yes, Chris Wallace.
I was wondering,
Sorry.
boy, I missed that one.
No, I was showing my age there. Because he was prepared for Donald Trump to say some of the stuff that Donald Trump always says. And one of the most ridiculous, this was the thing that I fact-checked in 15 minutes, the most ridiculous thing that Donald Trump had ever said, which was he said that he was going to save he was going to save $300 billion in prescription drug expenses by negotiating for them in Medicare. So the problem with that is there's only $78 billion worth of prescription drug expenses in Medicare. So how are you going to save $300 billion? So Trump said, oh, I'm going to save $300 billion in Medicare. And then Mike Wallace said, well, actually, sir, here is what is spent on Medicare expenditure. And he put up a chart. $78 billion. So Trump said, Trump just said, well, but I'm going to save $300 billion. It didn't really mean anything. But, you have to be absolutely certain that you're right if you're going to fact check. So, and I think it's really
I think I'd like to see fact check pop-ups during the debate. But on the screen, wrong. There was 300. There aren't $300 billion, and just
Well, actually, one thing I saw, there's actually an International Fact Checkers Association. It's now,
That sounds like a John Sayles novel.
yeah, because in the last, since 2010, in 2010, there were only 4 fact-checking organizations in the world, 3 of which were in the United States. Now there are about 100. They've spread around the globe. They're in Latin America, they're in Europe, they're across Asia. So we have these annual meetings. And I was very impressed to see in Spain, right after the presidential debate, literally, they had the debate between the 2 candidates, and right after the debate, rather than have the stupid talking heads
Spin room. People like
spinning,
me.
yes, people like you, they had an immediate fact check of what was said in the debate. And it was really impressive. They put together a half-hour show. Well, the president said this, but this is not right. And so
Yeah.
they went through and they did it right there on TV right afterwards.
That'd be great. I'd love to see that here because that is something that might have some impact on the actual candidates. If they knew that, instead of people coming out saying, my guy did great, or you got, right, because, the audience, starts to dwindle. It dwindles as the debate goes on, but, because all networks now, and a lot of people, a lot of newspapers do get to that. And often it's the next day, or it's later in the evening, but it's not, it doesn't hit that prime audience of people who are just tuning in for the debate. So if you could do that here, you'd hit tens of millions of more people who then would walk away just thinking what they want to think anyway. But as we've already determined, any more questions? Ed, you paid for this room, so you get to.
Sorry to jump in. First place, this is great conversation. I'm really learning a ton. I have maybe a very general question. I hope it's not too general, but it seems that across a whole bunch of advanced industrial democracies, governance isn't really working very well. So Brexit, there's stuff going on here, and that whether it's the left or the right that's governed over the last decade or more, it seems like a lot of people in the middle class, they're just not getting a whole lot. In that context of failed or not so great governance, if somebody like a Bernie Sanders or a Donald Trump says something to people, it's like the unspoken truth, you are getting screwed. I think even if those people don't believe other craziness, you don't need to believe all kinds of craziness to say that guy is at least speaking the truth, whether I believe it or not. I can see why a lot of the middle class, pieces of the middle class would say, that nutcase, he's the only one speaking the truth. And I wonder if it's possible that in that kind of crazy context that we're in, fact-checking doesn't matter anymore. Like nobody cares about the little facts because somebody is, to them, saying some kind of big truth. And even if that guy is saying one lie after another and is a pig and everything else, he's kind of resonating, and the sort of truth that you and I might agree, like this fact is wrong, doesn't seem to be getting the play that it should. And I just wonder what you think about that as somebody who's really doing this great job generating all of this fact check. Are we in such bad shape that it just doesn't?
Well, but see, actually, I would argue that, overall, the state of the nation is actually pretty good compared to where it was 8 years ago. That was a real crisis, and some of the angst and anger out there is because of things that are not related to economics. So, the Gallup poll did a really deep dive in the data, trying to figure out what makes a Trump supporter. And what makes a Trump supporter is not economics. It is not being exposed to globalization. In fact, many Trump supporters have good jobs and make good wages. The thing that most identifies a Trump supporter is living in a neighborhood or an area which has few people of color, and having lived in that area your whole life. So it's that Donald Trump is not speaking to some larger, truth. I mean, I haven't seen data for the Bernie Sanders people. I'm not sure what's going on there. But I'm just saying, with Donald Trump, it's a real misnomer to say this guy has seized upon economic anxieties and anger about the globalization of, no, his voters generally are people that have not been exposed to people of color and have not been exposed to a changing American society, and they are frightened of it.
Well, the word you used there that's key, I think, is changing. And I think there are different layers or different tectonic plates of anxiety out there. And you see, certainly culturally, I glibly said at the beginning of the Trump campaign that a lot of these people are mad they have to push one for English and two for Spanish, because I do think that's part of the change that they are having a hard time coming to terms with. I do think that's that there is somewhat of an economic context as well, in the sense that even people who've done well in the recovery, or have decent jobs now, there still is a level of economic insecurity.
Well,
You know,
they're worried that
you know,
things won't be there for their kids.
Won't be there for the
It's a
kids,
worry
for
about
you kids who are getting out of school. And I think they worry too that, some of the myths that we had growing up, I can say that now at my age, at our age, that if you do the right stuff and you get a good job, you can, life is sort of a series of progressions, and you can stay at a job a long time, a company a long time. All that's kind of shot to shit. And so even if you're doing well now, or okay now, or not so bad now, I still think there's a lot more insecurity than there was for people in that same position 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Sort of the post-World War II bargain seems to have broken down. And we do see, this is fascinating to me, from the left, there's been a lot of arguments about the gap in income and the income inequality, growing income inequality in this country. And that fueled a lot of the Bernie, I think, supporters. And and Trump is sort of playing it in a different way, not to do anything about it, but in general, it does seem, I think, to a lot of people, even people who are doing well, don't feel like they're winners anymore. They feel either they're besieged by changing demographics, or they have to worry more about their economic security, or their kids. And a lot of this is, and they look at Washington, and they look at, people who are in charge, and they say, you don't seem to be doing much or getting it. And even though I would argue that Obama's tried, Clinton's tried, there's some Republican things, they don't get it in the gut. They don't really, feel like they're doing something.
Well,
And these are sort of big issues that I think is going to be very hard for our country to contend with. And I think it's going to be very hard for any president in the immediate future to have a successful presidency, to sort of deal with this, particularly in an era of divided government.
Well, I think the key there is divided government. I mean, part of the thing that actually concerns me is whether or not the government structure that we have now is actually able to adapt to the world that we now live in. I mean, there is something. I've thought about this. If we had a parliamentary democracy, you could see where there would be, you would actually see there would be a Bernie party on the left, there would be a Trump party on the right, there would be kind of a Jeb Bush party, Paul Ryan party, and there would be a Hillary Clinton party.
Yeah.
And, you would have an election, and suppose you had the Bernie and Hillary party get a majority in parliament, and Hillary became the prime minister, but she would have to take Bernie Sanders and put him in charge of different agencies.
Yeah.
And that government then could implement its program. There would be compromise between the two factions.
It could do things.
It could do things.
Yeah.
And it would keep doing it until they could no longer sustain a vote in parliament. The government would fall, and then in response to whatever, and you'd move on.
Yeah.
And our system right now is completely broken because you have, if you end up again with a Republican House where you have a large part of that party, those people there feeling that their only goal is to thwart the Democratic president, nothing will happen and people will just be frustrated. Whereas in a parliamentary system,
You get each party whoever wins gets a shot at doing what they want to do, and then eventually they collapse or the public says, okay, enough of that, let's try something else.
Right, and
Right.
in this case, even if Donald Trump were to win the election, he couldn't do a lot of the things that he is promising his people, because, you know, he could, you know, there would be the filibuster to deal with. There would be all sorts of things, so he would end up with lots of frustrated supporters, because Donald Trump would not be able to get his program through Congress.
Well, he's going to end up with a lot of frustrated supporters one way or the
Yeah,
other,
right.
which is probably a topic for another day, maybe after the election, when we come back here with more liaison of NPR. So our time is up. If you want to buttonhole us, I think we will be in the hallway, and you can do that. But I thank you all for coming. They were great questions. And let's thank Glenn.